I would argue that the disruptive nature of the new digital economy technology turns out especially hard for firms to adopt. Organizational changes, tenant requirements, and other complementary investments don't all that easily or quickly translate into faster productivity growth. If I would be here in 10 years, I'd rather be here and say, look, there really wasn't as much in the new digital economy to drive productivity growth, as I said back in 2018, than that I would have to admit and say, you know, in 2018 we missed a productivity revival once again. I may be wrong, but let's remember that, productivity growth is a long-term matter, and it will be the only way to bring potential growth to higher levels and improve living standards.
You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hi, this is Jonathan Liu. You're listening to Indications from the Conference Board, your inside look at the issues that business leaders are focused on and talking about in today's global economy. Today, I'm speaking with Bart van Ark, our chief economist here at the Conference Board, on the topic of productivity. The Conference Board has extensively researched this topic over many years. We've compiled data on productivity for many countries, and we've held extensive discussions on the topic. Bart, before we get into what's happening in productivity now, we need to ask, what is productivity and how should businesses think about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Productivity is much talked about, but it is really badly understood. It's often thought as something like, selling a lot more or doing things cheaper. And those are all important parts of a productivity equation. But instead of me answering this, I suggest we first hear from another expert, Jana Remes, a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. They recently published a very good study on productivity, and she joined us on a virtual panel on productivity as part of our Window On series. And she responded to exactly that question of, what is productivity and how should business understand it? So let's listen to that first.
The one thing to keep in mind about productivity is that we sometimes focus more on the efficiency. So we think of the productivity story of only being half. It's a ratio of output to input. So clearly we can improve productivity by reducing the inputs needed for specific output. That's the efficiency case, that's the cost cutting, that's the labor efficiencies. However, the other half comes from the fact that you can increase the output for the input you put in. And that actually, when you look across the economy, has generated over half of the productivity growth over the last 50 decades or so. The fact that we now not just need fewer labor hours for each car produced, but the value of the car, the performance, the features have grown as much as the efficiency. So I think we need to keep both of those sides in mind.
So what she says is it's either efficiency or growing production and gaining market shares. And the latter is at least as important as the former.
There's been a lot of discussion about a productivity slowdown, although later in this podcast you will argue for the case for productivity recovery. But first, what are the reasons for the slowdown?
Well, indeed, the numbers have been showing quite a slowdown in productivity pretty much globally. To give you an idea, using our own data set at the Conference Board, our total economy database, measured output per person employed in the world economy has spiraled down to about 2% since the mid-2000s. And it was more than 3% in the decade before. So in 2015 and 16, it was even as low as 1.4%. And that's a record low since the early 90s, with the exception of the Asian financial crisis in 1998 and the global financial crisis in 2009. Now, again, explanations for this are multifold. And again, I suggest we listen to another participant in that panel that we did in April 2018. And this time it's Dirk Pilat of the OECD in Paris. And he joined us also remotely. And I asked him for the reasons for the productivity slowdown. So let's listen to that.
There is a lot of discussion on this, of course, and I don't think we know exactly what the slowdown comes from. I think if we really go back to the whole slowdown since the post-war period, well, partly we've run out of steam a little bit in sort of some of the catch-up growth, sort of where countries were learning from each other and firms were running from each other. So in that sense, some of the slowdown has been natural. I think what's more important is what we've seen in the past decades, when first I think we had a slowdown in sort of what's called multi-factor productivity growth, this whole effect, which is partly about technological change. And then since the crisis, we've also had a slowdown in investment, which meant that we've had less growth coming from capital deepening. Where exactly the slowdown comes from, I think we're still not entirely sure about. There are a lot of theories around it. I think one factor is probably that we had a lot of growth coming from digital technologies already in the 90s and early 2000s, particularly in the United States, but in a couple of European countries as well. I think a lot of people say, well, that's probably run out of steam a little bit. Now we have a lot of digital technologies coming in the pipeline at the moment. They're probably not quite working through into productivity growth yet either. So there are many things going on. I think one thing which we're trying to add to the debate from the OECD side is go a little bit beyond the aggregate story. So we did some work on looking at what we've called global frontier firms, basically really looking at the firm level. And there we found that the top firms in different industries in the world have really still had pretty strong productivity growth, even going into the past decade. But a lot of the rest of the economy has fallen behind. So partly productivity growth is still going on. It's just not as broadly based as it needs to be to have a big impact on aggregate productivity. So I think that's part of the story. And we need to understand a little bit better why some firms are still doing so well and others are trailing behind.
So what's important here is that first, technology doesn't always directly translate into productivity growth. It takes time. And second, that some firms recently have been doing much better in terms of productivity growth than others, which means there's an unusual dispersion in terms of performance.
And we've also heard that the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 has played a big role in creating low productivity firms. How does that fit into the picture?
That's a really important point. And again, Dirk Pilat of the OECD has something really interesting to say about that too. So let's listen.
I think there have been impacts, and it's always hard to disentangle the cyclical impacts and the long-term impacts. I think one thing I mentioned already is that I think since the crisis we haven't had the same level of investment in many OECD economies, which is really reduced labor productivity growth. I think the other thing which we are finding is that we've seen in many countries also a large number of firms having what we sometimes call zombie firms that are really have very, very poor productivity growth. They've accumulated in quite a few countries, and the crisis may have something to do with that. It may be because of partly soft monetary policy, which probably enabled some of these firms to survive. They might have otherwise exited the market. So yes, I think there are impacts of the crisis as well on productivity growth as we see it at the moment.
By the way, these clips are from a virtual panel on productivity that we held this past April. It includes several great guest speakers, and it's posted on our website, which we'll include the link of in the show notes. So getting back to Bart, now that the financial crisis effects are largely behind us, as many seem to say, it seems that is there room for some optimism on productivity?
That's right. And in fact, I would argue that while we'll keep racking our brains over why productivity growth has slowed so much over the past decade, actually the return to an era of faster productivity growth may be happening right before our eyes. And I'm saying that because it wouldn't be the first time that we have failed to observe a productivity revival. Actually, most of the time we miss a productivity revival in real time. For example, if you look back at the 1990s, we now know that there was a significant acceleration in productivity at that time, whereas much of the literature was then still talking about the end of the post-World War II manufacturing model in advanced economies and the failure of emerging markets to make up for that as they were recovering from a decade of debt and crisis. But what we missed at that time was the massive impact of information technology since the mid-1990s, especially on services. And that together with the productivity enhancing effects of China's entry to the WTO, global output per person employed increased at more than 3% on average between 1995 and 2007. And that's quite high historically.
That example from the 90s is fascinating because it sounds just like the conversation we're hearing today. Right. What is the evidence we have that a revival is happening now?
Well, first of all, there are the numbers. So in 2017, average output per worker actually increased again back to 2%. And the current projections for 2018 suggest a possible improvement to 2.3% in terms of global productivity growth. And much of that recent improvement is actually coming from mature economies. In the US, for example, we see about 1% productivity growth in 2017, and in 2018, 1.3%. In the euro area, we saw 1% in 2017. We may see a little more again in 2018. But at the same time, of course, emerging markets keep growing their productivity also, and still about twice as fast as in mature economies.
So, that sounds promising, but, the numbers of, 1% in the mature economies still seems like a pretty modest improvement. Is it true? Are we anywhere near to the growth rates of the 1990s and 2000s?
No, not quite. It's true that it is still relatively low, and we should not declare victory over the productivity slowdown too quickly, because the cyclical nature of productivity explains a fair part of that recovery. The IMF, for example, claims that as much as 75% of the recovery in productivity is cyclical, and that pro-cyclicality is likely to wane as the business cycles mature. But still, I would argue there are at least 3 reasons why we should be cautious in not writing off any structural improvements prematurely. First, as productivity growth in 2018 seems to be holding up so far, it actually creates the possibility that if we could keep the business cycle going for just another couple of quarters, especially if investment stays strong, that would be a good thing for productivity. And then second, when we look at sort of sectoral level and industry level, the evidence seems to show that productivity in manufacturing is still well below the pre-crisis level, but market services productivity growth in the services sector, which in fact was hit much harder during the crisis, especially in Europe, is now approaching pre-crisis levels. And that's by far the largest part of the economy, as we all know. And then thirdly, and finally, there are some signs of recovery in some complementary investments in what is sometimes called intangible capital. That includes things like research and development and databases and other types of digital innovation and organizational transformations, and that go along with this digital revolution. And these numbers have recently seen a fair pickup after a period of slow growth after the crisis. And this would be especially important to the extent that it is related to digital innovation. And it is especially, again, very important for the market services in the economy.
I actually have a more sort of basic question. Given the changes in the economy, are we measuring productivity in the right way? Are those numbers as meaningful as they can be?
That's a good question. The statistical research shows indeed that the increased importance in digital technology could indeed complicate the measurement of productivity. In the late 1980s, Robert Solow, who was a Nobel Prize winner, quipped saying, you may see the computer everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And today you may actually say the same thing about digital technology. For example, we may not measure quality adjusted prices of digital investments very well, and we struggle by including free content into our statistics. And these measurement problems may perhaps not be as much as some pundits have argued, but better measured productivity could be somewhat faster than we currently assume. And that would in fact strengthen my argument about the recovery that we're looking at, because even an understatement of a few tenths of a percentage point could make a big difference for where productivity levels may end up in about 10 years from now. And also, while measurement problems may be small at the macro level, they may be much bigger at the sector level or at the firm level. And that really puts the perspective on structural change front and center at the story.
Okay, so that really gets us to the heart of the matter. This structural change that's playing out now, it's largely related to the digital revolution we're seeing, right?
Exactly. I would argue that the new digital economy, which you can define as the combination of the move towards mobile, ubiquitous internet access, and the cloud, that may finally begin to show up in business productivity growth. It's well understood from historical studies that the diffusion of general purpose technologies like new digital technology can take a long time. But there's been a lot of confusion by not making a clear distinction between the diffusion time, which is the amount of time that you need before the technology is available to sectors and firms, and absorption time, which is the speed at which the new technology is successfully adopted and begins to kick in at the bottom line of better business performance. And in fact, I would argue that the disruptive nature of the new digital economy technology turns out especially hard for firms to adopt. Organizational changes, tenant requirements, and other complementary investments don't all that easily or quickly translate into faster productivity growth.
And so the cloud, mobile, always on internet, they've been around for a while. Why do you think this digital technology is finally kicking in now to strengthen productivity?
So one piece of evidence that progress seems to be made can be observed from some survey evidence that we did with our own members at the conference board. For example, 2 years ago, less than 50% of CEOs in our annual CEO Challenge survey either somewhat or strongly agreed with the idea that they had an effective digital strategy in place. A larger share of them would argue that the real disruptive effects would not kick in until about 10 years from now. This year, when we asked the same question, the urgency has intensified to immediate, and a much larger share of companies are now focused on a stronger implementation strategy with regard to digital technology.
Can we drill down on that a little bit? Where and how do you see the productivity effects from this technology happening?
Yeah, so 2 decades ago, there was an American economist, Arnold Harberger, who described in a very interesting way how productivity gains spread across the economy. And he spoke of two different types of growth. One type of growth is characterized as mushroom growth, in which a limited number, a somewhat random number of sectors and industries and firms experience a much better productivity performance than others. So in today's context, that means that, for example, driverless cars on our roads and robots around every corner and artificial intelligence overtaking the power of our human brains, that easily causes us to exaggerate the macro productivity impact of that. In addition, the rise of big tech firms and broader scale effects of digital technology are two of the reasons behind the sort of widening productivity gap between a small number of very well-performing superstar firms and a large number of lagging firms. And that indeed is what we've been seeing in recent years. Now, the second type of growth is what Harberger calls yeasty growth. And that's when the productivity improvements spread from that small number of top-performing companies and sectors much more widely across the economy. And we may not yet be fully harvesting the yeast effects, but it seems that accelerated investment and widespread spending on cloud and digital services in many industries and the increased usage of digital platforms and increased wage premiums on skilled labor, that all seems to be pointing in the direction that there's a broader emergence of automation and digitization. So surely the data are not yet fully up to date, and the recent evidence is still to a large extent anecdotal and case study based, but it seems to me unwise to entirely ignore this sort of transition from a mushroom to a yeasty effect of growth coming from digital.
So I've heard some people argue that whatever happens with technology on the supply side, the real question is whether there's demand.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Various studies have indeed argued that in the post-financial crisis period, slow demand has been a real barrier for productivity growth and for technology. For example, low investment for several years has now been seen as a source of weak productivity growth. And the effects are in a way exacerbated by the corresponding slowdown in intangible investment that I mentioned earlier. But as both are now showing some signs of recovery, and there's a longer business cycle, as I argued a little before, we could now see that demand is beginning to pick up and have a sort of more lasting effect on productivity growth. But there's a more concerning factor on the demand side, and that is the role of an aging population and rising inequality as potential threats to the recovery of the demand channel. But still, I'm hopeful even here that in my view, tighter labor markets will ultimately translate into higher wages, demand will strengthen scale effects and shift towards higher quality products and services, and that should then ultimately, if properly measured, of course, translate into faster productivity growth.
So I think that's a more promising story than we've heard often. What are some things that could go wrong to prevent this productivity revival from hitting full steam?
Yeah, so we definitely need to talk about what could go wrong. And quite a few things can go wrong. First of all, we should not forget that many productivity recoveries coming from new technologies did not last, or perhaps even never materialized. In a recent paper, Eric Brynjolfsson, who is an economist at the MIT, gives a few really nice examples of things that did not materialize as expected. And I have it here, and I'd like to quote from that paper that he wrote. So this is what Brynjolfsson said, and I quote, "Nuclear power never became too cheap to meter, and fusion energy has been 20 years away for 60 years. Mars may still beckon, but it's been more than 40 years since Eugene Cernan was the last person to walk on the moon. Flying cars never got off the ground, and passenger jets no longer fly at supersonic speeds. Even AI, artificial intelligence, perhaps the most promising technology of our era, is well behind Marvin Minsky's 1967 prediction that within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved." End of quote.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, so to me, the message from that quote is that we shouldn't stare ourselves blind on the hype of the day, but also we should not jump off the wagon too soon, but be a little patient to see how this is all going to play out. So that's the first thing that we have to be careful about, that, the productivity recovery in the technology may not really play out in the way that we're hoping. Secondly, productivity growth ultimately comes from innovation. And that is often linked to another economist, a classical economist, concept of creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter. So creative destruction is a great term that we really like to think about when we think about innovation, because it creates things and it destroys things. But it seems that the destruction part of that argument hasn't happened as quickly recently as we hoped for. And that goes back to the quote by Dirk Pilat, which we played earlier. Much of the recent productivity slowdown in the aftermath of the financial crisis can be ascribed to the wide availability of cheap credit and misallocation of resources, the rising share of zombie firms. And now that interest rates are rising, this may change because capital is becoming more expensive again. So while a postponement of the recession may be a good thing to enjoy the benefits of faster investment, the flip side is that a recession may in fact be needed to accelerate the destructive part of creation and destruction and to force the structural change. So a third reason why we should be concerned is that there are big concerns about the workforce not being able to handle this transition. So on the one hand, there may just be too many people at risk of losing their jobs and drop out of the workforce. But on the other hand, there may be too few people with the skills required to make the transition to faster productivity growth happen. Both is probably true, and the biggest problem in my view is that the policy and the business environment aren't really able to deal with that conundrum and to facilitate the transition. I think the circumstances will ultimately to force us to adjust one way or another. We either make adjustments to attracting more talent, or we're going to lose more people out of the labor force. So a fourth reason to be concerned about this, whether this is going to play out, is that the regulators may mess up the productivity recovery. And if the regulators don't do that, then incumbents may lobby their way against productivity regulatory reform. So, for example, the recent issues around Facebook and Cambridge Analytica are just an example of the flaws in today's technology models. And they also coincide in a very interesting way with the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe back in May. And the rise of a rising surveillance state, as you may have seen in The Economist a few weeks ago, that could actually mean that, for example, China and the Western world are going to respond in a different way to these challenges of the new technology. So some of these mundane regulatory issues could actually be turned into a geopolitical drag on productivity growth.
Is there anything else that's a fear that you have?
Yeah, so it's a long list. So there's one more that I want to talk about, and perhaps is quite often ignored in mainstream economics, and that is the failure to address the changes in socioeconomic and institutional changes that need to go together with new technology. Today's regulations and policies, but also consumer behaviors and the whole cultural and institutional framework are shaped by the old technology regime. And recently, Carlota Perez wrote a series of blogs in which she argued that two conditions to force a change towards a new socio-economic paradigm, as she called it, are now in place. First, there's the potential of the new technologies, and that potential is fully known and available. And second, the current period of experimentation in a relatively unregulated environment threatens the current stability through social unrest and pressure for change. So her concern really is that strong vested interest in finance and politics may postpone those adjustments and therefore unnecessarily lengthen the period where we see this divergence in productivity happening between different companies and different socioeconomic systems.
So that's a pretty long list of what could go wrong. What should be done to avoid having the new digital economy of today go the way of flying cars or nuclear power too cheap to meter?
Yeah, and end up on the heap of productivity failures, as we have seen before. Well, without being exhaustive, let me mention three things that I think are critical from the perspective of a research agenda. So first, we need to go back to the basics about how productivity contributes to economic prosperity. The obvious link between productivity and welfare through the wage channel, that seems to be broken. And the other link, lower prices for products and services that consumers buy, that still works well, but it doesn't seem to be enough to strengthen the overall purchasing power that consumers have. So the distribution of the gains from new technologies seem to be very unequal right now, and that may just be temporary, as the socio-economic convergence model that I just explained argues. But to make the change, we need to break up many existing institutions, and we have to change many rules. And research really should help to understand it better what that could look like. A second thing that is important is that we have lost our understanding of the connection between productivity and profitability. We know that the two are clearly not the same, and that scale and competition dynamics and rewarding mechanisms can lead to disconnects between those two. But the elasticity between lower or near zero prices and scaling up volumes may have profound impacts on how these factors relate to productivity, to profitability. But in the longer run, a failure to see profitability not driven by productivity is not sustainable. So something will have to give, and research again can help, on what that could be. Third, and the last thing that I think is very important is that we need to get a much better handle on how digital transformation impacts on productivity growth, especially in the labor market. The call for education, for more education, has in my view become a rather meaningless mantra, unless we better understand what type of education, how that is provided, and who has access to that education. And notably, extending a system in which government and business and education institutions collaborate to provide the education of the future. That seems to be key.
So summing up, it sounds like the numbers on productivity may be more promising than what some of the naysayers believe, but in order to really reap those benefits, we may have to rethink what productivity is, how we measure it, who benefits. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think we really should not overhype the current productivity recovery and the way that technology is changing it. This is a difficult technology, and the evidence that it's kicking in while visible in the data is still pretty scant. But I really fear that the bigger risk is that we are so underwhelmed by the headline numbers and the aftermath of the crisis that we're missing what is happening below the radar screen of the macro statistics.
So if we were sitting down again in 5 or 10 years, what would you say if the signs of the current productivity revival do not materialize into actual lasting faster productivity growth?
Well, welcome to the world of economic forecasters. But if I would be here in 10 years, I'd rather be here and say, look, there really wasn't as much in the new digital economy to drive productivity growth as I said back in 2018. That I would have to admit and say, in 2018 we missed a productivity revival once again. I may be wrong, but let's remember that productivity growth is a long-term matter, and it will be the only way to bring potential growth to higher levels and improve living standards.
Thanks, Bart. That's something we'll definitely be keeping our eyes on at the Conference Board and at Indications. Bart van Ark, he's our chief economist at the Conference Board and was the anchor on our monthly virtual panel, Window On. Today, we played you a few segments of that program, and you can listen to the whole thing by following the link in the show notes. And I encourage you to subscribe to stay tuned with the latest of what we're hearing at the Conference Board from business leaders around the world. Thank you for joining Indications. We'll hope to see you soon.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.